For the next group of lectures, it might help if we imagine ourselves in a sort of combination time machine and space machine orbiting the Earth somewhere and looking down during the era of agrarian civilizations over 4,000 years. And what we're going to be looking for is a sort of pattern of spread and rise and fall over those 4,000 years. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to accelerate the pace of history very much, and we're going to look at it from outside the Earth, take the view from space. The previous lecture described some general features of agrarian civilizations as if agrarian civilizations were static. Now what we do is we start looking for long-term changes over 4,000 years. What were the main changes in this era that was dominated by these huge, complex societies we've called agrarian civilizations? Can we stand back from the details and focus on the major changes? Can we see them as if from space? That's the question we tackle in this and the next few lectures. So we ask, how did agrarian civilizations change during the 4,000 years of the later agrarian era? In this and the next two lectures, I'm going to focus on the Afro-Eurasian world zone. It's by far the largest, it's by far the oldest, and by almost any criteria, it's the most influential of the four world zones. And then after these three lectures, I'm going to look at the rest of the world, and that will allow us to try to get a sense of how typical the experience of Afro-Eurasia was, how great the variety was of historical trajectories in different parts of the world during this era. And beneath this comparison of different world zones, there lurks this deeper question that we've touched on already. Do civilizations, or do human societies more generally, change perhaps in somewhat similar ways? Do they evolve in roughly similar directions? Or do they, for the most part, go their own ways? This question has a bearing on the even deeper issue of whether or not there are long-term tendencies in human history that have shown up wherever conditions were somewhat similar. And by now, you'll not be surprised to find that I will be arguing that there were indeed some striking similarities. Human history is not just a story of random change, so that every society can go entirely in its own direction. There are these long-term steering factors that seem to have driven human history, even in very different regions, along roughly similar trajectories. So we want to get a sense of both the similarities and the differences between different agrarian civilizations and different world zones in this period. And we'll see that one of the reasons for some similarities is diffusion. The fact that over time agrarian civilizations in some regions began to touch on each other. They began to exchange goods, ideas, and people. And eventually, they began to affect each other. So that's one of the reasons for the similarities. But when we look across world zones, we'll be comparing regions which had virtually no contact at all with each other. So that is the real test of the long-term similarities in the trajectories of history in different regions. Okay. So what we're going to see is that there are indeed a lot of differences, but underneath them we're going to find some striking and I think deeply interesting similarities that can tell us a lot about the nature of human history and indeed about the nature of being human. Okay, now on to Afro-Eurasia and the Afro-Eurasian world zone. What I want to do in this lecture is to describe two distinct ways in which agrarian civilizations in Afro-Eurasia expanded during almost 4,000 years. So this is very much the view from our combination space and time capsule over 4,000 years, but we're focusing on Afro-Eurasia. The first is expansion. I want to look at the way agrarian civilization, this new type of human community, spread around Afro-Eurasia, how it occupied larger areas and incorporated more and more people. So the expansion of agrarian civilizations. Secondly, I want to look at the increasing power and reach of tribute-taking states. States are at the core. the core of all agrarian civilizations. And we'll see that over 4,000 years, their power expands, their capacity to control resources, their capacity to control people. As rulers became more skillful at their trade and more knowledgeable about how to rule. And that knowledge, political knowledge, if you like, accumulated over 4,000 years. So there's an emerging political technology. As knowledge and understanding of governments and the nature of power began to accumulate within the elite groups that ran tribute-taking states, we'll see their reach increased, and so did the power of these states. So these states got larger, and they seem to have got better at the task of organizing and ruling these large and complex societies. Okay, so first, expansion. I want to look at the way agrarian civilization as a type of community expanded in the Afro-Eurasian world zone over 4,000 years. During this period, agrarian civilizations of some kind spread to incorporate most of the population of the Afro-Eurasian world zone. We begin 5,000 years ago in 3000 BCE. 5,000 years ago, agrarian civilization existed in Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia, and also in Egypt, and that's it. 4,000 years ago, in about 2000 BCE, we can add one or two new areas. Agrarian civilizations, we can say, also seem to have existed in the north of the Indian subcontinent and along the Yellow River in northern China. Now, I need to qualify that, of course, by saying that there is no absolutely rigid marker of the appearance of agrarian civilization. So once again, these are rough sketch map dates I'm giving, but agrarian civilizations light up in the Harappan region, along the Indus Valley in the north of the Indian subcontinent, and in northern China, along the Yellow River. By 2,000 years ago, agrarian civilizations were also flourishing around the Mediterranean basin. This is the era of the Roman Empire, remember. In South China, the Chinese Han Empire is now dominating not only the north of China, but also the south, and also in parts of Southeast Asia. And then by 1,000 years ago, agrarian civilizations have spread to Africa south of the Sahara and to both Western and Eastern Europe. We can get a slightly better sense of what this really means if we try, roughly speaking, to measure the expansion of agrarian civilization. And here we're talking not just about the states, but the areas they controlled as well. Now, none of them had rigid borders. So again, there's a fair amount of guesswork here. But there's an Estonian scholar who has attempted to make some very rough calculations about the area incorporated within agrarian civilizations over this 4,000-year period. And this is the Estonian-American scholar Rein Taagepera. And here are some of his figures. He estimates the area included within states in square megameters. To get a sense of what we mean by a square megameter is probably roughly the size of modern Egypt. So now we need to upload a sort of mental map of Egypt to get a feeling for what a megameter is. These are very rough calculations, of course, like Eric Chasson's calculations of energy flows. But what we'll see is that they do help us to get a sense of a larger pattern, even if there's plenty of wriggle room on the details. And here are the results of his calculations. In 3000 BCE, states controlled just 0.2 square megameters. Now, Taagepera calculates that this represents about 0.2% of the area of Afro-Eurasia controlled by modern states today. And of course, that essentially means the whole of Afro-Eurasia. This is a tiny area. Today, states control virtually the entire region. So what these figures show, what this first set of figures show, is that when agrarian civilizations first appeared in Sumer and Egypt, they were quite remarkable. They were exotic, they were very rare. They affected a tiny number of people initially. The vast majority of people 5,000 years ago, and we need to remember this, because agrarian civilizations are so exotic, they'll tempt us to think about them and to forget everything else. We need to remember that most people still lived in the types of village communities that had become the dominant type of human community during the early agrarian era. In 1000 BCE, we've now moved on 2,000 years. Agrarian civilizations control almost 10 times that area, almost 2.5 square megameters. But even that's only about 2% of the total area of Afro-Eurasia that's controlled by modern states. Now, this is a very significant expansion, but it's still a reminder that most of Afro-Eurasia remained outside agrarian civilizations. Then, 2,000 years ago, with the appearance of huge empires in Persia, China, and the Mediterranean, agrarian civilizations covered about 8 square megameters. This is about 6% of the area under modern states. This is about 40 times the area controlled when states first appeared. So this gives us a pretty good feeling for the expansion of agrarian civilizations, even if it also reminds us of how much of Afro-Eurasia remained beyond their borders. And by 1000 CE, agrarian civilizations, according to Rhine Tageperer's calculations, covered about 16 square megameters. Now, that's still only about 13% of the area controlled by modern states, but it's about 80 times the area controlled by the very first states just 4,000 years before. So that gives us a very rough way of measuring this process of expansion, measuring the area controlled by agrarian civilizations. Now, on the assumption that these figures are not too wildly inaccurate, what do they mean? Let's try and summarize what they're telling us. One thing they clearly mean is population growth. Agrarian civilizations included the most flourishing and the most productive regions of agriculture on Earth. So these were the regions in which we should expect populations to be growing most rapidly. And the growth of populations is therefore a key ingredient in the growth of agrarian civilizations. Now, unfortunately, we can't measure precisely the growth of populations within agrarian civilizations. So we're going to have to use a sort of surrogate, and that is plausible estimates of world populations. As the agrarian civilizations of Afro-Eurasia incorporated probably an increasing proportion of world populations, this may give us some very rough idea of how the spread of agriculture continued to sustain population growth, and how the spread of agrarian civilizations parallels growth in populations. So here are some figures for world populations. Again, of course, they're very rough estimates. They're probably the best we can do at the moment. But this is the story they tell. 10,000 years ago, world populations are estimated to have been about 5 or 6 millions. By 3,000 years ago, by 5,000 years ago, I should say, by 3000 BCE, there were probably about 50 million people on Earth. Now, what this means is that in the early agrarian era, human populations had multiplied by about 10 times. Then, by 1,000 years ago, at the end of the later agrarian era, there may have been about 250 million people on Earth. So let's just think about those figures for a moment. What that means is that populations had multiplied by 5 times in 4,000 years. They'd multiplied by 10 times in 5,000 years in the early agrarian era. What's this telling us? Well, I suppose we can say these rates of growth are roughly comparable. If anything, they suggest that rates of population growth may have been slightly slower in the later agrarian era. And that's slightly surprising. It suggests that population growth was not more rapid in this era than in the early agrarian era. It's curious, and it's a fact that we're going to pick up later on, because it may be telling us some quite important things about the nature of agrarian civilizations. Okay. Tageperer's figures also remind us of the limits of agrarian civilizations. They remind us that until quite recently, many people in Afro-Eurasia still lived outside agrarian civilizations in small communities of pastoralists, foragers, or independent peasants. We must not let ourselves get so dazzled by them that we lose sight of these many communities. But what they do is chart a fundamental transformation in human society. 5,000 years ago, most humans in Afro-Eurasia lived outside of agrarian civilizations. 3,000 years later, it's probable that most humans lived within them. This is at the time of the Roman and Han empires. And by 2,000 years ago, agrarian civilizations had become the normal type of community for human beings in Afro-Eurasia and probably throughout the world. The role and significance of agrarian civilizations in human history had been transformed in this 3,000 to 4,000 year period. From a new but rare and atypical type of community, they had become, by 1,000 years ago, the most important, powerful, and numerous of all human communities. And most humans on Earth almost certainly lived within the borders of one of them. Now I want to look at the second major change in the later agrarian era, and that is the increasing power of states. States lie at the hub of agrarian civilizations. They're the crucial organizing structures of agrarian civilizations. The area under agrarian civilizations expanded, at least in part. One of the factors was because tributary rulers learned to control larger areas. So what I want to look at now is, as it were, this evolution in statecraft, as tributary states became, on a long trend, more efficient at doing what they did best, which was control large areas and exact tributes. In 3000 BCE, tributary states were new phenomena. They were novelties, and their rulers were still unsure of the best ways of managing such vast and complex communities. But over the next 4,000 years, a lot of political, military, and economic skills accumulate. And as a result, so the reach and power of tributary states expanded. The basic challenge was to maximize the resources rulers extracted from populations that consisted mainly of small holding peasants. And we've seen that we call resources that are extracted in this way, always with the threat of coercion in the background, though often through claims that states have the right to exact them, we call them tributes. And we do that to contrast them with two other ways of moving resources. One is gifts. That is a situation in which someone freely and willingly gives resources to someone else. And the second is profits. Profits are transfers of wealth that are generated through exchanges on competitive markets. And profits are going to become a very important form of wealth generation in the modern era. Tributes could be exacted through the crudest of coercive methods, but we'll see that states, like disease parasites in general, found that they could actually extract resources more efficiently and for much longer periods if they used subtler methods where possible. And these methods included claims to legitimacy, the blessing of the gods, for example, and claims to provide services such as protection from foreign invaders. One reason why rulers so often portray themselves on monumental architecture as killing the soldiers of foreign armies is presumably to inspire confidence that they can do this, that they can protect you. It's a way of encouraging people to join their team rather than the other one in return for tributes. Now, the trick of being a successful tributary ruler is to maximize resource exaction without exhausting the capacity of peasants to keep paying. That's the general trick. Now, Ryan Tagapera has tried to estimate roughly changes in the areas controlled by particular states. Now, we're no longer looking at agrarian civilizations as a whole. We're looking at the areas controlled by particular states. So let's look at his calculations. His calculations highlight four main eras in the expansion of state power. The first city-states covered tiny areas. Uruk covered about 2.5 square kilometers. That's a tiny fraction of a square megameter, though its rulers also controlled nearby villages. The first Mesopotamian state to include several city-states, that of Sargon of Akkad, may have controlled 0.6 square megameters. So these are rather small states. Sargon's state is significantly bigger than that of, say, Uruk. It includes several city-states. In the second millennium BCE, the very largest states, those of Egypt at its height and Shang China, probably controlled a maximum of about 1 square megametre of territory. That, let me remind you, is about the size of modern Egypt. And most states controlled much less. So 1 square megametre seems to have been a sort of upper limit for empires formed before about 1000 BCE. Then we get a huge leap forward and it seems to be associated with the Achaemenid Empire, which was founded by Cyrus II in Persia 2,500 years after the appearance of the first states. It was founded in 560 BCE, and it was then overthrown by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. The Achaemenid Empire covered at its height about 5.5 square megametres. For the next 1,500 years, the largest states that appeared would range from about 4 square megametres, that was probably the size of the Roman Empire, up to about 10 square megametres, the size of some of the earliest Islamic empires. In the last 1,500 years, much bigger empires have appeared, starting with the Mongol Empire, which briefly controlled about 24 square megametres. Now again, this is a sketch. These are very large trends. And what these figures hide is eras of collapse and decline, such as the decline of Mesopotamian states early in the second millennium, which we've talked about already. And we need to remind ourselves that contemporaries almost certainly did not experience history as a prolonged expansion of agrarian civilizations. They were much more likely to be aware of the slow rise and fall of dynasties and empires. And that's a phenomenon we'll look at in Lecture 35, when we look at factors that checked growth in the era of agrarian civilizations. Nevertheless, with the benefit of hindsight and Target-Perez calculations, the long trend towards increasing state power seems unmistakable. Now, what was going on? What was it that states did that increased their reach and power? Clearly, there was a slow learning process going on as each ruler learned new techniques of rule and as these techniques slowly diffused between different states. Let me just look at some of what seem to have been the critical changes here. One is simply improved military techniques. These are states that do rely to a considerable degree on coercion. They seem to have been engaged in warfare of some kind almost continuously. So military improvements may be part of this. Rulers learned to recruit and equip larger armies. They learned to use auxiliaries such as pastoral nomads from the Eurasian steppes. They introduced increasingly sophisticated weapons such as chariots and siege weapons. Some of the more important innovations in this area actually came from the inner Asian steppes, a region dominated by pastoral nomads, where mobile cavalry warfare was practiced with great efficiency by nomads such as the Scythians. Chariots with solid wheels were drawn by oxen are depicted in Mesopotamia as early as 3000 BCE, but the first evidence of light, rapid and highly mobile war chariots drawn by horses and with spoked wheels appears in tombs in the steppes of modern Kazakhstan about 2000 BCE. And that technology spread rapidly both east and west. It spread to China and it spread to Mesopotamia and to the Indian subcontinent. In the Indian Rig Veda, we learn that chariots were used either for the hurling of spears or in ritual races. They become both symbolically and in real terms crucial to warfare. Improved communications are also part of it. The most powerful and the most successful rulers often spent a lot of effort road building in establishing large roads along which armies and messengers could be sent. And they also established courier systems or post-horse systems which allowed probably the most rapid transmission of information of anywhere in the world. Let me briefly describe one of the most famous of these roads. It's known as the Royal Persian Road, and we have a wonderful description of it from the Greek writer Herodotus. It was built between 550 and 486 BCE by Cyrus II and his successor Darius I, and it was about 1,500 miles long. It ran from Susa in southern Persia through Babylon and Nineveh to Izmir and Ephesus on the Aegean coast of modern Turkey. It probably followed the path of an earlier road, which was really a track that may have existed as early as 3500 BCE. In 475 BCE, Herodotus said that it normally took about 90 days to travel the entire route, though royal post riders could travel it in as little as 20 days. It was guarded along its entire length. And Herodotus writes in Book 5 of his histories that royal stations exist along its whole length, and excellent caravanserais, stations where you could stay overnight, restaurants, hotels, motels, we'd call them today. And throughout, he continues, it traverses an inhabited tract and is free from danger. In chapter 898 of his histories, he describes how the system of roads and post houses was used to transmit royal messages. And let me quote this passage. Nothing, he writes, nothing mortal travels so fast as these Persian messengers. The entire plan is a Persian invention, and this is the method of it. Along the whole line of road, there are men stationed with horses in number equal to the number of days which the journey takes, allowing a man and horse to each day. And these men will not be hindered from accomplishing at their best speed the distance which they have to go, either by snow or rain or heat, or by the darkness of night. The first rider delivers his dispatch to the second, and the second passes it to the third. And so it is borne from hand to hand along the whole line, like the light in the torch race which the Greeks celebrate to Vulcan. A wonderful description. And it shows that the most intelligent and far-sighted rulers could do a lot of work on what today we might call infrastructure. There were also improved systems for collecting tributes. In all agrarian civilizations, tributes seem to have been collected through chains of intermediaries, with local power brokers extracting local taxes and then passing them on to regional governors, regional authorities, governors or satraps, they were called in Achaemenid Persia, who passed them on to the central ruler. Once again, from Achaemenid Persia, we have a wonderful literary and visual description of the system by which tributes were exacted under the rule of Darius. In 518, Darius created 20 distinct provinces, each headed by a governor, a satrap, and a separate military commander. And Herodotus, in his histories, lists the amount of tributes paid by each province. For example, Babylon and Syria, two of the core provinces in the empire, both in Mesopotamia, and probably the richest of the provinces, each paid 1,000 talents, the equivalent of about 30 tons of silver. And the trading provinces of Phoenicia, Palestine, and Cyprus paid about 350. Some of this wealth was turned into coins, which was the first to circulate in Central Asia. And the empire as a whole was run from a central bureaucracy in Susa. Now, subtler methods of skimming off taxes also developed. As their reach increased, states created large zones of relative stability within which peasants and merchants flourished, so that both populations and available resources increased. And in such times, the interests of rulers, peasants, and merchants probably came closer together than ever before. And the most skillful rulers recognized the fact that if they looked after their people, it might eventually benefit them, like the most intelligent disease parasites. Here's a nice quote from an 11th century Persian prince writing to his son. He says, "Make it your constant endeavor to improve cultivation and to govern well. For understand this truth, the kingdom can be held by the army, and the army by gold, and gold is acquired through agricultural development, and agricultural development through justice and equity. Therefore, be just and equitable." And finally, rulers often use their wealth to enhance their power in other ways. Today, we might call this propaganda. They bound ruling elites together through distributing wealth. They overawed their subjects by displays of religious monuments or other monuments. In an age before newspapers, these were powerful forms of propaganda. And once again, there's a wonderful example from the Achaemenid Empire. It's the Behistun inscriptions carved by the Achaemenid Emperor Darius in 515 BCE on a cliff face in Kermanshah province in Iran. Darius proclaims on these inscriptions high up on a cliff, "I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, the king of Persia, the king of countries, the son of Hystaspes, the grandson of Arsames the Achaemenid." And accompanying the inscriptions are wonderful, vivid bas-relief depictions of 10 captured subordinate rulers wearing the appropriate dress. They're tied, they're clearly captives. They wear the appropriate dress of peoples from different regions. These inscriptions, incidentally, were the key, eventually, to deciphering ancient Persian, ancient Elamite, and ancient Babylonian. Okay. We've seen, therefore, a lot of ways in which agrarian civilizations expanded and spread, and we've seen also how tributary states became more powerful and better at their job over a period of 4,000 years. Now, the next lecture is going to ask a slightly different question. Is this growth that we're looking at, to what extent is it dependent on innovation? Did agrarian civilizations encourage or discourage the capacity for innovation that is such a distinctive feature of our species? That's our next question. Thank you. On the major changes, can we see them as if from space? That's the question we tackle in this and the next few lectures. So we ask, how did agrarian civilizations change during the 4,000 years of the later agrarian era? In this and the next two lectures, I'm going to focus on the Afro-Eurasian world zone. It's by far the largest, it's by far the oldest, and by almost any criteria, it's the most influential of the four world zones. And then after these three lectures, I'm going to look at the rest of the world, and that will allow us to try to get a sense of how typical the For the next group of lectures, it might help if we imagine ourselves in a sort of combination time machine and space machine orbiting the Earth somewhere and looking down during the era of agrarian civilizations over 4,000 years. And what we're going to be looking for is ever conditions were somewhat similar. And by now, you'll not be surprised to find that I will be arguing that there were indeed some striking similarities. Human history is not just a story of random change so that every society can go entirely in its own direction. There are these long-term steering factors that seem to have driven human history, even in very different regions, along roughly similar trajectories. So we want to get a sense of both the similarities and the differences between different agrarian civilizations and different world zones in this period. And we'll see that one of the sort of pattern of spread and rise and fall over those 4,000 years. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to accelerate the pace of history very much, and we're going to look at it from outside the Earth, take the view from space. The previous lecture described some general features of agrarian civilizations as if agrarian civilizations were static. Now what we do is we start looking for long-term changes over 4,000 years. What were the main changes in this era that was dominated by these huge, complex societies we've called agrarian civilizations? Can we stand back from the details and focus on the experience of Afro-Eurasia was? How great the variety was of historical trajectories in different parts of the world during this era. And beneath this comparison of different world zones, there lurks this deeper question that we've touched on already. Do civilizations, or do human societies more generally, change perhaps in somewhat similar ways? Do they evolve in roughly similar directions? Or do they, for the most part, go their own ways? This question has a bearing on the even deeper issue of whether or not there are long-term tendencies in human history that have shown up where